Lovely to be with you all. Lovely to be with the folks in Northeast Victoria. Haven't been there for a while, but love it. And you guys are the hotbed of community energy, which makes me so happy. So as Cam said, I co-founded Community Power Agency back in a decade ago. Bit over a decade ago now, and worked for almost a decade around community energy. And then 2 years ago, I joined WWF to work at the other end of the scale. So not at the community scale, but at the mega clean exports, massive transformation scale. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. Pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and that, you know, in the work to address the climate crisis, there's a lot that we can learn from Aboriginal people and their culture and the time on this land where they have looked after it so well. So I've got some slides. In fact, I thought I might share a combination of 2 slide decks. The first is a little bit about what we're doing at WWF, and I'll try and incorporate a community energy perspective, noting that not what I do so much anymore. And then I thought I would also share just a few highlight slides from a report that we released last week that talks about the clean export opportunity, and particularly for Australia's regions. Maybe for those people who are on camera, a bit of a show of hands. How much, so one of the things that we've done some work on is hydrogen. How much would you like to hear about hydrogen versus the general clean exports opportunity? So hands up for hydrogen. Hands up for general clean exports opportunities. Okay, all right. Well, I haven't got my slide deck around hydrogen open, but maybe I'll see whether I can incorporate a few bits and maybe link to a couple of articles and documents. Okay, give me a sec. Let me share my screen. All right, here we go. So, hi, can people see that? Let me get it on presenter view. People see that?
Looks good.
The title's out of date. So this should say October instead of May, but I think I should start off with sort of sharing some of the work that WWF more broadly is doing. So off the back of the bushfires, and WWF Australia did huge and amazing rapid response supporting wildlife carers and a wildlife response to the bushfires back in the 2019-2020 summer of bushfires that I know affected your region so severely. And off the back of that, you know, we've built a program that really tries to say we need to learn from this moment, and we need to take a new approach, a regenerative approach. And so under Regenerate Australia, which is a new bold vision that WWF has put out into the world this year, we have 4 key pillar projects. And these are not the only things that WWF works on, but they're sort of the flagship initiatives. So one is our Koalas Forever work, working to double the number of koalas on the east coast of Australia. The second program is around towards 2 billion trees, so halting biodiversity loss and habitat protection. Then we have an innovation program, and I believe the folks in Kooryong might have been engaging a little bit as part of this. It's called Innovate to Regenerate. And if you've seen the 2040 film by Damon Gamo, I believe soon we're going to have a 2030 film that is part of our Innovate to Regenerate campaign. So that's exciting. And then there's the program that I run called Renewables Nation. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. Is this sharing? Was that sharing okay?
Yeah, seems to be working well.
Okay, cool. Just didn't see the edge. Okay, so why Renewables Nation? Why are we doing this work? WWF is traditionally thought of as a conservation organization, doing a lot of work with species and habitat protection and uh, why renewables? So the first is, well, climate, we have a climate crisis, and that climate crisis will not only affect people, but species and nature around the world and here in Australia. And then if you look at Australia's biggest contribution to climate change, it is our fossil fuel exports. This graph shows that in the light orange, 2/3 of the emissions that come from things we make in Australia are exported emissions, and 1/3 are domestic. So for whatever, a bit over 2/3. So basically, if you think about Australia's emissions, you've got to double it for the size of our export emissions. And that's because we're the world's leading exporter of thermal coal, we're the world's leading exporter of liquid natural gas, and second largest exporter of gas. We're the first largest exporter of coke and coal, but we're also the largest exporter of iron ore, bauxite, lithium, and a range of other minerals as well. So there's some interesting opportunities as well as some big threats. The second reason we're doing this is we don't think that we can continue on at a federal level as we currently are. We need to shift the politics of climate change in Australia. We need to shift Australia from being a climate laggard to a climate leader. I think you've probably all followed the trajectory over the last 8 years, the repeal of the carbon price, Morrison bringing in a lump of coal, last year's push for a gas-fired recovery, but then the current push for a net zero commitment. And while net zero by 2050 is nowhere near enough, it is certainly a step in the right direction, and we can come back to that. So one of the ways we're doing this is we're trying to shift the frame of the climate debate in Australia. So a lot of the focus in the past has been around the costs of climate change or the impacts of climate change, and also the moral need to act on climate change, so sort of the case to do that. But one of the things that has resulted from a lot of that narrative is that there has been a false choice posed in the media and by politicians, that it's really a choice between acting on climate change or the Australian economy. And we know that isn't the case. So we've focused a lot in the last 2 years of going, actually, climate action equals jobs and investment. And so our campaign is all about telling the positive solutions-orientated stories of how Australia can prosper as we act on climate change and as the world decarbonises. So if we get this right, we think our campaign can help with 4 things. One, it can help replace our fossil fuel exports. Second is it can help change the climate politics in Australia. The third is we think that while Australia has traditionally punched above its weight in terms of contributing to climate change through our exports, that actually, because we have some of the best solar and wind resources in the world and some of the key minerals needed to make clean energy technologies, we can actually play an oversized role in helping to decarbonize the global economy as well. So we can help to decarbonize hard to decarbonize countries and sectors of the economy. And then finally, because it's me and because it's WWF, we want to make sure, we think if we do this well, we can also make sure that the transition to renewable energy is socially just and leads to net environmental gains. So it is also good for the environment. So how can renewables be not just a climate solution, but a nature solution as well? And I suppose it's in that social justice piece that community energy really comes in. I've worked in that area for such a long time, and I bring those networks and that approach to our work. So that's why we're doing it. So what are we trying to achieve? So our goal is to help accelerate Australia to be the world's leading exporter of renewables by 2030, and in the process help switch Australia and the world to a low carbon future. What do we mean by that? Well, there's sort of 3 things we mean by that. The first is the scale. So we think that if you look at the studies, that we need to be aiming for an electricity system that is 7 times as large as our current electricity system. And that's really broken up into 3 elements, and they shouldn't be thought of as steps because all of this needs to happen at the same time. So one of the elements is decarbonising the current electricity system, and that's what a lot of community energy groups are particularly focused on. So moving to 100% renewables, replacing particularly coal-fired power stations with renewables backed by storage. That's been the focus of the conversation for most of my career. It's incredibly important work that's ongoing, but it's not sufficient. Because this, what we also need to do is decarbonise our total energy use. So we need to decarbonise and move to renewables, and for the most part, renewable electricity for our building energy needs, our transport energy needs, and our industry energy needs. And predominantly that will be through electrification, but where there are some processes that are hard to electrify, renewable hydrogen is probably the most promising opportunity to decarbonise, and that then also uses renewable electricity. And then there's the third piece, and that's the export piece. And so that's creating the new industries that will make things that Australia and the world needs. And so that's the scale of what we're talking about. So we talk about 7 times or 700%. The report that we released last week by the consultancy Accenture, we released it with the Business Council of Australia, the Australian Council of Trade Unions, and the Australian Conservation Foundation. That report found to meet the export opportunities that they had identified, we would need to increase our electricity system by 6 times. The day before we released that report, Transgrid, the transmission company in New South Wales, released a study that said if we want to be a renewable superpower, we similarly need to be expanding the size of our electricity system by 6 times. So, 5, 6, 7, multiple times is the scale of renewable electricity backed by storage that we need to be targeting. And that doesn't mean that there isn't a role for community energy. There absolutely is. In fact, it's more important, not less, because we need so much renewables. So the second thing that we've brought to the table is starting to define what we mean by renewable exports. So there's a lot of talk and a lot of hype around renewable hydrogen and its derivatives like ammonia. Now that's one possible way that we could export renewables. And there are some promising, particularly the ammonia piece has a lot of promise and importance from decarbonising the chemical industry and the shipping sector. The second opportunity is really around direct electricity transfer. So you've probably heard of the Sun Cable project in the Northern Territory, which plans to build a very long HVDC cable from the Northern Territory to Singapore through Indonesia. And that made some progress yesterday. So we're watching that project with interest. But we think that the biggest opportunity in Australia is what we call solar or renewable powered products and commodities. Basically making things with our abundant, cheap renewables that Australians and the world need. Things like green iron, green steel, advanced manufactured goods, aluminium, and other things. So basically the clean export opportunity is actually a manufacturing opportunity for Australia. And there's a great quote from Tim Reid, the chair of the Business Council of Australia, that says, we're moving from a paradigm in an energy system where the energy was very expensive to extract, but very cheap to store and transport, so the oil, coal, gas, to a system where, or a paradigm and technology set where it's very cheap to extract the energy, but it's quite expensive and difficult to transport and store it. And so that means that if you can co-locate manufacturing and the making of things and an energy intensive industry alongside or close to the source of production, the renewable generation, then you will have a comparative advantage. And that means that Australia is yet again the lucky country because we have so much renewable potential. whereas some of our trading partners like Japan and South Korea and Singapore, less so. So then there's the other types of renewable exports. There's our expertise, our education and training systems, our financial, legal, business, engineering expertise. Then there's the clean technology itself. So we could make batteries. We already export lithium, but let's refine it here, turn it into batteries, and then reprocess it and move to a circular economy. Interestingly, I'm not sure if you saw, but 2 weekends ago, the Queensland government and Twiggy Forrest stood up and said that they're making the world's largest electrolyser manufacturing plant in Gladstone. So this clean tech manufacturing process and export opportunity is really starting to become real. And then the final piece, and this is one that I think community energy groups and the organisations that you partner with have a huge opportunity around, which is the software and services. So we know, and you know through your microgrid projects, that the decarbonisation of our electricity system comes along with the digitisation, and there's bits of kit and software and services to manage the integration of variable renewables, of rooftop solar, of batteries, of electric vehicles. And that is the kind of software and services that is going to be needed worldwide. Whether you're in a remote community in the Pacific or a big grid in China. So the breadth of the opportunities around clean exports are huge. And one of the things that we're really keen to do more around is basically really doesn't matter whether you are a tradie, a miner, someone who works in manufacturing, someone who works in IT, in HR, in engineering, in education, you can have a renewable or renewable powered job. And the job opportunities are really across the economy, and they will be centred in regional Australia. And I'll come back to some more evidence of that. So that's what we're doing. Our program, what are we doing? We're telling stories. We're doing a whole bunch of advocacy with government and industry. We're looking at how to do market activation and sort of trying to shift the market. And then we're doing some work looking at how do we improve the performance of the renewables industry along the supply chain, and would love to be doing more to support community energy given that community energy has such an important role in doing just that. I'm not going to go into that. We did one of the first pieces of work just as I started that we did was look at what is the narrative, what's the story that we're trying to tell, and how will it resonate with the Australian public. And we tested about 10 different narratives with a series of focus groups. And these are we tested it with people who didn't vote on climate at the last election. So you are not the audience for this narrative. It's the people in your communities that maybe don't deny climate change is happening, but are pretty skeptical and just think that there are many more important things. This kind of narrative is ones that we think and we know is starting to shift people. And we've been using this narrative for about 2 years. And if you look at a lot of News Corp's Mission Zero campaign this week, that you'll see some pretty strong similarities. This kind of approach that speaks to Aussie pride, our can-do attitude, the fact that we're getting on with it, and the fact that we can become a clean energy superpower. And we have all the ingredients, we just need to get on with it. Other things that we know is sort of really starting to resonate and is really helping to shift the politics, as I was mentioning earlier. So how do we deliver on this program? We've done a bunch of policy work. So we've got a clean exports paper. We did some work around renewable recovery last year. We did a piece we've got a position paper on renewable hydrogen. And then we've been working very closely with Beyond Zero Emissions on this concept of renewable energy industrial precincts, which are clusters of heavy industry powered by renewable electricity, clean heat, and renewable feedstocks like hydrogen. And those clusters then serviced by shared infrastructure, so shared transmission, pipelines, port infrastructure, logistics, training, skills programs. And we've been doing a lot of work, particularly in the Hunter and Gladstone as key locations where we think they could become renewable energy industrial precincts, but also if we shift the perception of what is possible in those regions, then the flow-on implications for the transition are quite significant. We released a renewable superpower scorecard where we assessed all the states and territory governments and the federal government on a series of criteria that we think are needed to make Australia a renewable superpower. Note the percentages are not percentages of renewable energy. We scored each government out of 100, and we had 20 indicators. Each indicator was scored out of 5, and then that led to a possible score of 100. And based on that scoring, Tasmania and South Australia are out in front, with New South Wales and Victoria neck and neck in third. We're just in the process of redoing this, and I have to say, Victoria's got a way to go. Obviously Victoria's doing a lot, probably the jurisdiction doing most to support community energy, doing most to support some of the sort of clean tech and the electricity system transformation, but isn't doing very much on the clean exports or the sort of total energy decarbonisation piece. Certainly some of the transport initiatives have been perhaps taking us in the wrong direction compared to, say, what New South Wales has been doing. We've been doing a lot of work telling the story. So we have a marketing campaign called United We Shine. And one of the things we're really trying to do is make sure that this connects with real people's lives. And so we've got a few heroes in our marketing campaign. Craig, he used to work at the Holden factory in Adelaide. And when it shut down on the Friday, on Monday, he went back to work at the same factory, but making batteries for Sonnen. So he's one of our heroes. And then Karen Stark, who you might be familiar with, who's a farmer in Western New South Wales who has solar on her land and a real champion for renewables and agriculture. We work with business. So we've got about 120 businesses that are signed up to support and advocate for Australia to become a renewable superpower. If there are businesses in Indi that might want to join us and become renewable superpower champions, we would love that. We've got an open letter with these businesses going to the Prime Minister next week, and we've done some great videos sort of showcasing what some businesses are already doing. Maybe we could talk to Indigo Power and do a case study with Indigo Power. I talked about industry transformation. This is a program that my colleague Monica Richter leads. It's called the Materials Embodied Carbon Leadership Alliance, and it's got now more than 100 companies and organisations like the Green Building Council, infrastructure bodies within government involved. And the purpose of it is to try and create demand for zero embodied carbon building materials like green steel, like green aluminium, which are also the types of things that we're trying to grow as clean export commodities. So, that demand side piece, we have some track record with through a program called the Business Renewables Centre that is helping corporates do purchase renewables. And we've taken that idea and imported it into the building and construction and infrastructure sector. So some really interesting practical work trying to transform the industry. We've got some partnerships. I've mentioned both. We're also hopefully next month going to launch a partnership with Original Power, supporting the establishment of the First Nations Clean Energy Network. And if you're not familiar with the work they're doing, they're launching next month, and I really encourage you to check it out. We've done some work internationally because WWF has offices in 100 countries, and a bunch more beside, but I'm going to stop my presentation there and just switch PowerPoints to talk to you briefly about the Clean Exports report that we released. Give me a sec. How's everyone doing? Good? Good.
This is great.
Thanks. All right. quickly share some top lines. So yes, this is the report we released last week. You'll see some similarities with the work that WWF's been working on for the last 2 years, but what we think it's pretty transformational to get the peak body for business and the peak body for unions really on board with this agenda as well. Basically, let me see. Can you see that slide deck, everyone? Great. They've done a little bit more analysis that goes into how ridiculously trade exposed we are in relation to fossil fuels. So basically, between our fossil fuel exports, our high embodied emissions exports, and our exports that go into high emissions products, that accounts for about 60% of the total export value of the Australian economy. So, and we are incredibly concentrated, like in terms of the different sectors and the different things that we do export. And so we really, whether we needed to act on climate change or not, we need to diversify our export economy because it's currently reliant on too few goods and commodities. But given that the world is acting on climate change and our major trading partners, and particularly Japan and South Korea, have committed to net zero emissions by 2050 now, we know that demand for our fossil fuels is going to decline. So what are we going to do about it? I've already talked about thermal coal and LNG, but just to reinforce, we are the world's third largest exporter of fossil fuels after Russia and Saudi Arabia, and I think that's particularly illustrious company to be keeping. So yes, majority of our trading partners are acting on climate change, not quickly enough, but still they're acting, and that means that we are trade exposed. But as I mentioned, we're the lucky country, so we have some of the best renewable resources in the world. And this report looked at 6 opportunities and how those different opportunities start to interact with each other. And actually, one of the exciting things is the total is greater than the sum of its parts, because all of these different sectors interfeed into each other. And so the 6 sectors that Accenture looked into were renewable hydrogen and ammonia, green metals, which is steel and aluminium, but also the first step in getting to steel and aluminium, so alumina and green iron. Critical minerals, mining and refining. We're not just talking about digging it up and chipping it off, we're talking about refining it so we can make things with it. Batteries, then education and training, and then the engineering and ITC and consulting sectors. And so basically what it says is, unless we can build up our education and training base, we're not going to have the skills to do our own decarbonisation efforts and own energy transition efforts if we're not investing in engineering, ITC and consulting services that are needed for a domestic transition, then we're not going to get there. But if we do, we can turn them into exports that not only benefit, so that these services not only benefit Australia, but the world at large. They looked, we started with a list of about 30 export opportunities, and we narrowed it down to those 6, and they looked at, they did an assessment, and then they've done a detailed analysis of a business as usual pathway, because some of these opportunities are happening, and then a policy pathway. So if we actually got serious about it, what could we do? But the thing about the policy pathway is it's conservative. So we're still only assuming we get, say, 1.5% of the global green steel market. If we wanted to, we could go a lot further than what is in this report. And BZE recently released their clean exports report, and they have a slightly higher level of ambition in some of their things. So this should be thought of as a minimum case, but it will take money. So the analysis looks at what's the revenue, what's the gross value added, which is actually the value to the Australian economy, and the direct and indirect jobs. And I'm not going to go through them all, but just suffice to say there's almost 400,000 jobs and $89 billion in gross value add by 2040, and that's annual. Services are essential. Here's how the clean exports we've projected in 2040 compared to our current fossil fuel exports. So we're more than replacing the revenue, we're more than replacing the gross value add, and we're almost doubling the number of jobs. And the real key point there is there are more jobs per dollar of value in clean exports than there are in fossil fuel exports. So there's two breakdowns of jobs that I think are really interesting. So one is, well, on this page, it's what kind of qualifications you need, and it's about a third no high school, no post-school qualifications, a third a bachelor degree, a third a higher degree, or no, a certificate, a vocational training. The majority of jobs, and these are the jobs in the clean exports, not in the renewables needed to deploy the clean exports. The majority are in manufacturing and mining, and then in services and education. So, you know, we think that's a good story to tell given the current national conversation. And where will they be? They will be in regional Australia. Not as many in Northeast Victoria, but again, that's because we don't look explicitly at the renewables jobs, and there will be more renewables in Northeast Victoria. Where it does concentrate are in places like Gladstone, the Hunter, Port Kembla, Portland, Whyalla and Port Augusta, the Pilbara in Western Australia, and places like that. So, you know, key existing industrial zones, particularly, as well as sort of the suburban regions of Melbourne and Sydney and Adelaide, where you might see some more of the commodity, like the battery manufacturing jobs. So that's the good story. Regional Australia benefits, carbon intensive regions benefit. It's a lot of traditional types of jobs. Here's the challenge. We need to increase our renewables deployment by 6 times, and that is a lot. We're talking about all of the renewables we've built in the last 20 years, doing that every year for the next 20 years.
That's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot. And then the next piece is the fact that this is affordable. You know, that actually the projections around cost around renewables, confirmed renewables, sit within the current range of what industry currently pays for electricity. So we can do this, and it's actually viable. But I'm not sure if you've seen the CEC report from Energy Council report from earlier in the year, shows we're going backwards. You know, we need to be increasing our deployment of renewables, and instead we're going backwards. The other challenge is there's a cost gap. It's more expensive to make green steel than dirty steel. It's more expensive to make green hydrogen than dirty hydrogen. And so there's a really important role for government policy in enabling all of this and bridging that cost gap, because the only way we do it is bring hydrogen and green steel down the cost curve is by creating scale. The only way you create scale is providing sufficient demand and, you know, at current rates. And if you think about rooftop solar that I'm sure all of you and I were involved in, that's what we did with solar. We paid high feed-in tariff prices. That created the scale that helped bring the cost of solar down the cost curve. So I think one of the most exciting things about this report is that we got all 4 organisations to agree to some policy asks. The first ask is a national clean export strategy with clear targets backed up by credible policies. And that's actually a clean export strategy or renewable export strategy has been something we've been advocating for about 18 months now. And then we've identified 5 other policy priorities. The first is coordinated investment in 7 clean export precincts, which was something we in BZE called renewable energy industrial precincts. But that would also support the renewable energy zones that support those precincts. $10 billion of co-investment in new industries, a $5 billion fund for workers and regions and delivered by a new energy transition authority. And I think that's the one that I hope that, if God forbid the local power plan bill doesn't get up, that we could start to incorporate some of the aspects of community energy into this sort of regional diversification energy transition authority piece. I certainly hope and very supportive of all of the local power plan advocacy, and think it's worthy of its own thing. But if we had to compromise, then this could be a way to bring it in. The second is the almost final one is looking at low carbon material procurement. So supporting public sector procuring zero emission steel, zero emissions aluminium, and supporting businesses to do that procurement piece as well. And then we need to talk about the scale. And we need to make sure that this is done in the next decade. So while this report looks at 2040, we can't wait until 2030 to get on with it, because the rest of the world is moving. So China just set a 100 gigawatt renewable hydrogen target last 2 weeks ago. If we want to be a player in renewable hydrogen, then we need to be talking about at least 6 gigawatts of hydrogen capacity by 2027. And there's basically a new green steel announcement every week globally at the moment. And so if we want to be a player in green metals, then we need to be getting on and building 3 green metals plants in the next 5 to 7 years. So, we've got to get on with it now. And I think it really reinforces the national conversation about the idea that it's about 2030, that this is the critical decade and we've got to get on with it. It's just going, not only do we need to do that to cut emissions, but we need to do it in order to capture these economic opportunities and ensure that we prosper as the world acts on climate change. I'm going to stop there. I'm aware that I didn't talk about hydrogen. Maybe we can have a bit of a chat about it in the Q&A. Hope that was interesting. It's at a different scale to community energy, very different from what I used to do. But I suppose for me, I see community energy as critical in creating the conditions where we can scale the renewables at the rate that is needed to be able to actually decarbonize. And I think that one of the things that we at WWF are trying to do is really help people grapple with the scale of the challenge. That, this is not just about replacing coal-fired power stations. We know how to do, we know most of what needs to be done about how to do that. But this is about Australia's total decarbonisation and global decarbonisation. And, what this report says is we need to be increasing the deployment rate of renewables by 9 times. But what the World Resources Institute found last year is that to meet net zero, globally, we need to be scaling the deployment of renewables by 6 times. So we're just saying we should go slightly faster than what the rest of the world is doing so we can position ourselves as a renewable superpower. And I'm going to stop there.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Nikki. We have a bit of time for questions. So there are a few questions in the chat, and then I'll open the floor up. Did you look at food exports, Zena from Cabarco said?
No, we didn't. So I'm part of the climate and food team at WWF. And so we do have a food program doing a whole bunch of work around blue foods and seafood and agriculture. But we explicitly chose to look just at energy within this report. And that was that was sort of the scope that we put around it. And I think one of the reasons for that is, so food and agriculture is a big contribution, and so is land use, but energy accounts for about 3/4 of our emissions and the majority of our export emissions as well.
Fantastic. Any other questions? Feel free to put your hand up so I know you'd like to speak. Yes, so we'll go Rob, and then we'll go Brian.
That's a fantastic ambition, and let's hope we let's make it happen. If Australia, increases its energy generation, electricity generation by 7 times, there's going to be a massive demand for solar panels and all those components that make up to it. That means the manufacturing of those components around the world we won't be the only people doing this. There'll be other countries doing it. Is there any way we can sort of estimate whether the world can gear up at that rate? Is that manufacturing, can it expand at that rate?
Yes, all of the analysis that we've seen says yes, that we can do that. And one of the good news is there's talk of doing some of that here in Australia. So, I often use solar as the cautionary tale of what we shouldn't do again. We invented the modern solar cell. It's now used in about 3/4 of the world's solar panels back in the 80s at my old university, the UNSW. But we didn't commercialize it. We didn't put in place programs to deploy solar PV in the 90s, and we didn't try and capture the manufacturing of solar PV. So it all went offshore. But then last week, 3 weeks ago, Fortescue, Twiggy again, said that he plans to build a thin film solar PV manufacturing plant here in Australia. He hasn't figured out where. Now, look, I won't say that I'm the biggest fan of Mr. Forrest and all that he does, but I certainly think he's being very helpful in shifting the debate and really getting serious about some of these clean export opportunities. There is a challenge around the scale of minerals needed. At one level, it does require an upscale, but one of the things is we're still at the relatively early stage of this industry, so we have the opportunity to bake in the circular economy from the start or from now. So we've just seen Vestas release its first fully recyclable, or almost 97%, I think, recyclable wind turbine. So that's something that I think we should be definitely pushing for, so that we're not just mining a lot of lithium and copper, but we're also refining it and recycling it and reusing it. And same with the steel we need to make for transmission towers and things like that. The other thing to note about the sort of scale, I think one of the biggest threats emerging is that there's a fear that the renewable energy transition will be harmful to nature. And I think one of the stats that I found really useful, and I'll share it in the chat if I have a second, is that actually, if you look at the amount of stuff that is needed for the fossil fuel economy now, and you compare it to the projections of the amount of stuff we need for the renewable economy in 2050, it's 300 times less. So fossil fuel economy digs up and extracts 300 times more material than the clean energy economy will. So there is just general resource efficiency baked in. And there was a really interesting report released by Sol Griffiths from Rewiring Australia just last week, the week before, which found that basically, if we move to electric vehicles, induction stovetops, heat pumps, and I know heat pumps is something that you guys have been doing a lot in Northeast Victoria, I wish more people were, you basically reduce the demand for energy by about 40%. So electrification is an energy efficiency measure because electrified technologies are just more efficient than combustion-based technologies.
Good answer. Very good answer.
Rambly answer. Sorry.
Okay, so over to you, Brian, and then across to Dennis Lambert after that. Brian, you're on mute, unfortunately.
Am I with you now?
Yes. We can hear you loud and clear.
Yeah. Thank you, Nikki. I couldn't agree with you more. An excellent report. The thing that really concerns me is all this is going to take an awful amount of investment, millions and millions. And
trillions and trillions.
Yeah, as Lily D'Ambrosio brought to attention in her webinar last night, the government's current attitude to climate change and supporting fossil fuel industry is deterring people from investing in Australia. Is there anything we can do about that other than getting rid of the government? It'd be nice to be able to do that.
Yeah, can't bet on it. Look, I think we're a week away from being at the end of the beginning of the climate wars. And the reason being that the political calculus around climate change has changed. And that means it is now as much, if not a greater political cost to campaign against climate change than it is to slam climate action. So the conservative side of politics has used climate change as a wedge issue successfully for over a decade, and used it to win elections. And now we are shifting to this case to the situation where that calculus has changed. Them using that wedge will actually likely cost them more votes than it will gain them votes. And we've done that. People on this call and all across the climate movement have done that. Now, that doesn't mean they'll suddenly become climate champions or anything like that, but it is the international pressure, it is the investment pressure, and the fact that, you know, this could affect mortgages and you know, is deterring investment in Australia is one of the factors that is contributing to that. So I think one of the important things to do is to continue to hold the feet to the fire, and to continue to push to shift the conservative side of politics, and both at a federal and state level. If you look at all three coalition state governments, they have now 3 of the most ambitious clean energy plans in the country. And so it is possible to change. And I think if you'd asked me that 2 years ago, I would have been incredibly skeptical of myself. But I you know, from doing this work for the last year, you know, the change isn't fast enough or far enough, but it is possible to change, and we need to do that because we can't be guaranteed that we will, you know, always have a Labor government or a government with, you know, independents like Helen, you know, in the balance of power. So that's one piece. The other piece is doing projects that are investable, you know, just getting on with it. And that's what I love about the community energy sector. It's getting on with it. And that's what I admire about Twiggy. He's getting on with it, and he's putting his money where his mouth is, and is attracting the investment. So I think, you know, we shouldn't wait for governments. Governments can unlock what is required in terms of the scale and the pace of change, but we don't have to wait for them to get started. Wait for them to get started.
Thank you, Nikki.
Thanks, Nikki. Good question, Brian. Dennis Lambert, we can't see you, but hopefully we can hear you. We're also struggling to hear you. Okay, we might come back to Dennis. Does anyone else have a question for Nikki? If you could raise your hand with the reactions button, that would be great. No, Nikki, it looks as though we're all clear. Did you want to, we've got sort of 5 minutes or so. Did
Look,
you
let
want
me just
to
share a couple
do
of links
hydrogen
on the report.
Yeah.
So let me share 3 links. So that, and then our clean export report link. All right, there we go. Just on hydrogen, I suppose, who here is is there anyone willing to admit to being a hydrogen skeptic? Cool, all right. It's very interesting at the moment. I feel like on one hand, you've got these people who are just all about the hydrogen. It's the panacea for everything. And then you've got people going, no, hydrogen is a distraction and a delay tactic, and it's a really big problem. And I think I would advocate that everyone actually takes a middle path on hydrogen. It is not a panacea, but it is also absolutely essential to decarbonising the global economy. So a couple of points on hydrogen that might be useful when you talk about it, if you talk about it. The first is hydrogen is an existing global industry. It's a big one. Hydrogen and its derivatives like ammonia are used to make fertilizer, explosives, refine oil, and they currently account, as a global industry, accounts for about 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a bit more than Australia domestically, not including our exports. And so one of the biggest opportunities and needs that we have around renewable hydrogen is to decarbonise the existing hydrogen industry. And so if we want to create scale to bring it down the cost curve, we reckon that's where you should start. Then the other thing about hydrogen is it's not black and white. It's also shouldn't be blue or pink or any other colour. We advocate just talking about renewable hydrogen and fossil hydrogen, and that keeps it very simple, and any colours confuse the hell out of everyone and also help blue wash the gas industry. Some very good gas PR people came up with the term blue hydrogen. So the other thing, so on the supply side, hydrogen is being used as a delay tactic by the gas industry particularly. So we only advocate for renewable hydrogen. We don't think there should be any government support for hydrogen from fossil fuels. Can go into why if you want. On the demand side, hydrogen is also being used as a delay tactic by the gas industry to continue the gas pipeline sector. So we're suggesting that hydrogen should be focused on traditionally hard to abate, hard to decarbonise sectors. And we don't think they should be called that anymore because we actually know how to decarbonise them. But basically, everything that you can easily electrify, you should. And everything that you can't easily electrify, you should look at renewable hydrogen really seriously. There's a guy called Michael Liebrich. I don't agree with all of his stuff, but he's got a great hydrogen end use ladder that says sort of different use cases for hydrogen, where they're essential and where they're likely to be outcompeted by electrification. And it's sort of a pretty clear split, like anything that is in the domestic or commercial sphere, so cars, cooking, heating, that type of thing should be electrified. And things that are in the heavier industry transport, that's where there's more likely to be a role for hydrogen. And the particular sectors we're interested in are renewable ammonia and hydrogen as a shipping fuel, renewable hydrogen as an input into the chemical industry or a feedstock, and renewable hydrogen is helping with high temperature industrial processes like steel.
That was great. Thanks so much, Nikki. Okay, we've got 3 minutes and 3 hands up. I think John Clark had his hand up first. We'll see if we can get through your question and Frank's and Terry's, but let's see how we go.
Why don't we take all 3 questions at once and then
let's do it. Okay, John, Terry. John, you go first, then Terry, and then Frank. Ask away.
Thanks, Cam. John Clark from Repower Shoalhaven here. Nikki, I agree with all of what you said. I had an opportunity the other day to have an interview on ABC Illawarra, and I made the point about commending any governments that believe that clean hydrogen is only from renewable sources. And my suggestion to everybody in this room is, when you get the opportunity, belt that as hard as you can.
Great. Thanks so much, John. Good point. Terry?
Yeah, I noticed I'm on Johnny Con lately here, by the way, Cam. I haven't been on this before. Look, just in relation to the Victoria strategy with hydrogen, or, it looks like they're deploying, in the south, which means, with wind farms and all that sort of stuff. And that indicates to me that they're going to get the hydrogen out of seawater from one point of view. So that's one question. How's the world developing that technology? And then the other one is biomass, hydrogen from biomass. And then also I want to couple hydrogen production out of biomass with what other very valuable processes and molecules, if you like, can we gain from that process prior to converting it into hydrogen?
So look, to be honest, biomass, like hydrogen is nuanced, bioenergy is nuanced, and I tend to steer clear of bioenergy as much as possible because wind and solar backed by batteries and pumped hydro is probably going to do the majority of the job. That doesn't mean you can't do bioenergy well, you can, but it also can be done incredibly badly. And in fact, there's a big campaign today. It's a big bad biomass day. Check it out on that hashtag on Twitter. So got some concerns about the newly announced hydrogen biomass project in Victoria. Molecules, feedstock to the chemical industry, I think that's an area to be explored. I think it depends on the scales and how it's done. In terms of the water side of things, two things to say. The first is hydrogen will use less water than traditional mining. And particularly fossil fuel mining. So it uses less water to produce a megawatt hour of electricity using hydrogen than it does to produce it with thermal coal. It uses less water to produce a kilogram of steel with hydrogen than it does to do so with coking coal. So that's the first piece. The second piece is where should that water come from? Because there will be water. We advocate that we should start by looking at water recycling, so wastewater as an input, and then we should look at desalination of seawater and potentially, where there's locating things where there's an abundance of fresh water, and Tasmania might be a good place from the water perspective, for example. So those are the three considerations, but I think it's really important to keep the clean energy technologies in perspective compared when we're talking about how they compare to fossil fuels.
Fantastic. Good question, Terry. Thank you so much, Nikki. That was a fantastic presentation.